Ghost ships can be terrifying. A vessel drifting abandoned at sea with no one on board, sometimes sailing under their own power, with all the items of those who had been on board left behind, are one of the scariest things ever in my opinion. I would nope out if I saw that while out on the ocean. And that's just one kind of ghost ship. There's many chilling stories out there, from recent times or even from long ago, such as one chilling case from the 1300s where the whole crew was dead from the plague. Or stories like the Mary Celeste, or in cases like the Ourang Medan where everyone was dead from an unknown cause. You probably know a few stories, but you probably don't know this one. And it's perhaps one of the most frightening. In 1940, the hulls of a ship in the Russian naval fleet were stalked by an unknown terror that drove her crew into screaming fits, moments of uncontrollable violence, and pure, unbridled terror that drove many to simply end it all throughout several voyages until all hands abandoned ship. Now, while the Ourang Medan has always been, in my opinion, the scariest ghost ship story of all time, and I know several because I love maritime horror stories, I never thought I'd find one that could compete with that one. But I think I have, and this is that story. One of the most unsettling, creepy, and outright terrifying maritime horror stories I have ever read. This is the story of the unseen monster that hunted the crew of the Ivan Vasil. So come back with me to 1940, and let's cover this maritime horror story. First, though, to truly understand the terror of this story, you have to come back with me even further, to a whole other ship entirely. In 1903, midway through a typical voyage, a Russian vessel called the Parrier was overrun with an eerie feeling of dread, of impending doom that began to make the crew feel anxious. Something was coming for them. The vessel itself was a ship with a perfect record, flawless performance at sea. The ship's job was handed to her as part of the ongoing preparations for a possible war with Japan that Russia knew was likely inevitable. And they would be right, because the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War was not far off. As one of the ships in the Russian fleet being used to get ready for that war, the Parrier's job was to gather up and then transport military supplies and equipment that would be needed in the war. And the crew of the ship were a mix of nationalities, including Russian, English, Scandinavians, Portuguese, all commanded by Captain Andrist. So, a good crew, a good ship, a good captain. It was all lining up to be a good voyage, even a simple one for some of the more seasoned of those on board. And indeed, it did start out that way. The weather was even calm and placid. But after leaving the Suez Canal for the next stage of their voyage, a feeling of unease descended over the ship, like a fog that starts off as small wisps that steadily grow thicker. The thing had come for them. That was all they ever called it. They couldn't explain it. That far out at sea, there should be nothing to make them feel the way they were, with the weather being calm and the seas peaceful. They couldn't escape the feeling. People started looking around corners because they knew something awful was coming. 2 days out from their destination, not very far at all, but very far if you're in peril, it struck. That night, a night with a full moon, the crew awoke to screaming. One scream, then another, and another, and another, and another. Even as the crew of the Parrier lay in their bunks, they began screaming in pure, unbridled terror. People awoke from deep sleep and began screaming immediately, seemingly completely unprompted. The officer of the deck had no idea what to do. Trying to calm his crew did nothing. People were just running across the ship, which moments before had been all well, silent and peaceful. Now the crew was running amok, screaming, pleading, and praying. Everyone was awake, and they felt the terror strike them too, one by one. They all began running around, attacking one another, cursing one another, sinking to the deck, unable to move, as the unexplained terror struck them all. One young sailor, named Alec Golvinsky, suddenly bolted to the railing and jumped off the ship without a moment's hesitation. And as soon as he hit the water, it stopped. The terror ripping through everyone stopped. just like that. Everyone stopped right away, trembling, terrified, shook, but okay. The dread had gone, and the ship was quiet again, like nothing had ever happened. They never found Alec. Whatever had come for them, it seemed appeased. Whatever it was, they described it as having no form, no name, no face, no need or want. But it was something conscious, something with will, even if it lacked any shape or form. It was just the thing. The thing vanished like it had appeared without explanation, and those it had hunted prayed it wouldn't return as they solemnly continued their voyage. I bet, to them, they wondered if the supplies that they could bring back to help prepare for the war was even worth it. Would Russia really miss any of it if they just made for land and stayed there? I'm sure those thoughts were going through the minds of many. Despite the scary events on the ocean that night, they continued their voyage. All was well afterward. They reached port without the thing striking again, but after they left, 3 days back out at sea, it came again. The same terror that struck them before had struck again. Once again, in the middle of the night, the monster was back. This time, no one died, but they were terrified that this formless, unknown thing was clearly stalking them. This monster was coming for them. It was playing with them, driving them mad until it took them one by one, always just one. It was picking them off, one by one, only ever taking one of them at a time. And they knew after its second visit that it would likely come again. And they were afraid. They were right. It kept coming back. Every night, one man reportedly screamed until his heart gave out during such an attack. At one port, about half the crew tried to jump ship, but they were all brought back. Captain Andrus couldn't promise them any form of safety, but they had to leave before winter struck. So, they set out for their destination of Port Arthur, and every night, the thing came back. 2 crew members killed themselves, and just 3 days out from Port Arthur, Captain Andrus did the same. The Parrier continued on this terrifying voyage, and when she finally arrived at port, all but 6 men deserted the ship, and many prayed to God himself that they would never have to take another voyage on the Parrier again. Why the thing targeted them, they didn't know, but those who stayed hoped that under new command and ownership for the second voyage, that the thing would not come back. The thing did come back, though. The journal of the ship's former second officer talked about how the thing kept coming every night to stalk the ship, roam the halls of the vessel, killing the crew one by one, or driving others to the point of killing themselves, or driving others still to kill their fellow crew members. All the while, they were wailing and screaming as the thing stalked the ship, drove them mad, hunted them down. Nowhere on board was safe from it, not the bottom holds or the top deck. The thing would find them anywhere they hid, or drive another member of the crew to find them where they hid. The journal ended one day before the ship arrived at her destination, with the former officer saying that the fear was too much for him. Former Second Officer Hansen shot himself after that final entry. The few crew left when the Parrier arrived at her destination all deserted the ship, telling everyone they could about the thing. At port, another captain named Govinsky, not related to Alec Govinsky, who was a man that feared nothing, heard the story and boldly declared that he would take the ship for the rest of the voyage. He would see the ship returned to Port Arthur. With a small crew, including a man named Nelson, who was intrigued by the stories and wanted to unravel the mystery, they set out. The thing came again. Nelson said it came like a gust of sudden, warm, dry wind that swept through the hulls of the ship. The men became bloodthirsty. They attacked one another in unhinged, homicidal rages until someone died. Once a death had occurred through murder, suicide, or any other method, all became normal again. Once the ship reached port, everyone bailed except the fearless captain and Nelson. Sitting in port for a time would not bring peace to the Parrier, though. The thing kept coming, sometimes waiting just long enough on a voyage that the crew would think it had gone for good, and then it would strike again. Eventually, even the fearless Captain Govinsky shot himself in the head. Finally, after voyage, always with the thing coming every night, everyone abandoned ship. Nelson sent word to the owners that no amount of money would ever convince anyone to go on board the Parrier again. And no one ever did, as far as we know. If someone did, they did not live to tell it. So that tale of terror was all fine and dandy, but what does that have to do with the Ivan Vasil? Well, they say history repeats itself, and it did on another ship. Decades after its original appearance on the Parrier, the thing came again. It struck again in 1940 on the vessel Ivan Vasil. Again, a vessel of the Russian Navy. Once again at night, the unknown and formless force stalked through the halls of the ship, sending sailors into fits of screaming terror, driving others into mad, uncontrollable homicidal rages, making others kill themselves. The thing was relentless. It never stopped coming. At night, while at sea, it came. Like the moon and the stars, every night it came. Every night on the ocean, it came. Even as the sailors, who had bigger things to worry about, there was a little thing called World War II going on at this time. This entity, with no motive, no name, no form, no shape, it just kept coming for them. It just kept coming, no matter what they did to try and stop it or escape it. Without fail, every night while the Ivan Vasil was out at sea, it came. Every night was something the crew dreaded. The terror would always come for them. Every night that the Ivan Vasil was on the ocean was hell. Every night, one of the sailors on board would not live to see the next sunrise. New crews would replace the old ones, and the thing would still come. It would still relentlessly haunt the halls of the ship, hungrily stalking the crew one by one. Men became paranoid, looking around corners out of fear of seeing the thing that was hunting for them. They never did. No one ever saw it. They just knew when it had come. Rinse and repeat. It was just like the Parrier all over again in many ways. Once again, the same terror, the same shadow, the same thing was terrorizing a ship in the same exact method that it had decades earlier. There was no way to deny it. It was truly back. The stories of the Ivan Vasil's voyages have become somewhat lost and not as well recorded as the voyages of the Parrier. Oftentimes, this ship and the Parrier are just completely mixed up or merged into one story. But the details that can be dredged up from the ocean floor tell us that the events were all very similar, almost identical to the events that happened on the Parrier, at least until the ending. According to the account printed in the Minneapolis Star about the Ivan Vasil, she ended up being taken to port in San Francisco, where she just stayed, as no one would dare to take her back home. Finally, the Ivan Vasil was taken back to port in Russia. And finally, off the coast from Vladivostok, the ship was burned and sank by the crew so that the thing would not be able to hunt the crews of this vessel and hopefully any others. These stories were spread around like wildfire in newspapers all around the world. Multiple reputable ones in the US included all printed the story. People were terrified of these tales of a thing stalking, hunting, and driving entire crews insane one after the other. The oceans torn up by war were seemingly haunted by something else, much more terrifying than any warship or submarine. Those in the navies of the world had much more pressing things to watch out for, but still. This had to be in the back of the minds of some, especially as they looked out into the ocean at night. The very sight I shared with you at the beginning of this video. And with all that covered, That was the story of the thing that hunted down the crews of the Parrier and of the Ivan Vasil. This whole saga was so bizarre. Even when it comes to the ocean, which is full of bizarre, mysterious, and terrifying stories, especially about ships and their voyages out at sea, and while I still think the Ourang Medan is scarier, this is just such a weird, obscure, and terrifying event from history that no one really remembers. What was the thing? Was it truly an entity, some strange form of mass hysteria, or something else? It brought such a strong negative power onto these ships, to put it mildly. We'll probably never know what it was, but that was the story of the thing that hunted the crews of the Parrier and the Ivan Vasil. If there was ever a place on Earth where there could be monsters and hauntings, the ocean is where it would be. I remember once standing at the end of a boardwalk at night and staring out into the pitch black ocean and sky, and that sight being one of the most creepy and deeply unsettling things I ever saw. And that's where I took that picture you saw at the beginning of the video. And I understand how it can be such a place of fear and stories of terror like these ones. Even just looking out into it on a starless night, looking at that blackness, you can't even tell where the horizon and the ocean meet. It's horrifying in a way I cannot put into words. It's just something you have to see for yourself to understand. So anyway, long rant aside, once again, that was the stories of the Ivan Vasil and the Parrier, and I do hope you enjoyed this scary story, and tell me what you thought about it. I think it's cool because stories like this are some of my favorites. I might very well write my own retelling of it like I did for the Ourang Medan and the Philadelphia experiment. And please stick around, not just for that, but because our Halloween videos are not done yet. Next week, we will be looking into the eerie image on Google Earth that shows a possible crashed plane deep in the jungles of Cambodia, and addressing what the possible ramifications of people still being stranded out there after all this time, after a whole decade, mind you, might mean. Until then, have a good one, everyone. Thank you for watching.